The saloon door groans open, spilling a rectangle of dusty afternoon light onto the warped floorboards. Elias Thorne stands there, blinking, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. The air is a foul stew of stale beer, cheap whiskey, and unwashed bodies. He's only here for a sack of grain and maybe some coffee, a necessary evil before the long ride back to the solitude he both craves and curses. A burst of raw, ugly laughter from the corner table snags his attention. Jedediah Vance, a man whose soul seems as pickled as his liver, slams his empty glass down. Useless, I tell ya. Jedediah slurs, his voice a rusty hinge. Can't hear a lick of thunder, can't speak a word of sense. More trouble than a sow in the parlor. Elias stays by the door, his hand resting on the frame. He knows who Jedediah is talking about. His daughter, a quiet girl you sometimes see flitting through town like a shadow, always with her eyes downcast. What are you going to do with her, Jed? Another man asks, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. Sell her, Jedediah declares, puffing out his chest. A strong back is a strong back, deaf or not. $20. For a lifetime of work. She can cook, clean, mend, whatever you point her to. Never talks back, that's a guarantee. The men chuckle. The idea is both appalling and, to them, grimly practical. Elias feels a cold knot tighten in his gut. He sees the girl in his mind's eye, thin, with hair the color of dried corn silk and eyes that seem to hold all the world's sorrow. He's a man who believes in minding his own business. His own grief is a heavy enough burden. But this is different. This is a rot that taints the whole town. Jedediah sees Elias lingering and sneers. What's the matter, Thorne? Your own quiet homestead getting too quiet? Could use a woman's touch, even a broken one's. He shoves a girl forward from the shadows behind him. It's her, Alara. She stumbles into the light, her threadbare dress hanging off her small frame. She looks terrified, her wide blue eyes darting from face to face, trying to read the malice she cannot hear. But when her gaze lands on Elias, she doesn't flinch. There's a flicker of something else in their depths, not hope, but a raw, desperate plea for decency in a world that has shown her none. The men around the table leer, assessing her like livestock. The knot in Elias's stomach turns into a hot, rising fire. He's seen men sell horses with more respect. He takes a step forward, his worn boots silent on the dusty floor. He pulls a small, worn leather pouch from his belt, its contents the sum of a month's hard-won profit. He doesn't count it. He throws it on the stained table. The coins land with a heavy, definitive clink that cuts through the drunken murmuring. $20, Elias says, his voice a low growl that commands the room's attention. And 5 more to drink yourself into a stupor so you forget you ever had a daughter. Jedediah's eyes, greedy and bloodshot, fix on the pouch. The transaction is done. The girl, Alara, looks from her father's triumphant sneer to the stranger's grim, unreadable face. Elias meets her gaze, and for the first time in a long, long while, he feels something other than the dull ache of loss. He feels a profound, terrifying responsibility. His life, and hers, are now irrevocably changed. They faced harsh judgment, but someone saw their true value. Before this story unfolds, tell us, have you ever stood up for someone unfairly judged? If you believe in looking beyond the surface, hit like and subscribe. The weight of the pouch on the table was a final, damning thud in the story of Alara's life with her father. Jedediah Vance snatched it up without a second glance at the daughter he had just bartered away. He was already ordering another bottle, his laughter grating against the sudden, tense silence of the saloon. The other men looked at Elias, a mixture of pity and contempt in their eyes. Pity for the fool who'd just bought damaged goods, and contempt for the man who'd just shamed them all with an act of plain decency. Elias ignored them. He turned his attention to the girl. She stood frozen, a small, abandoned island in a sea of hostility. Her hands were clenched at her sides, the knuckles white. He saw the faint tremor that ran through her. He knew he had to be careful. Any sudden move might send her bolting like a frightened deer. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod towards the door. It was a gesture of invitation, not command. Her eyes, wide and searching, stayed on his face, trying to decipher the intent behind the granite features. After a long moment, a moment in which the entire saloon seemed to hold its breath, she took a hesitant step. Then another. She walked past the leering men, past the father who was already celebrating his profit, and stopped a few feet from Elias. She did not look at him, but at the open doorway, at the promise of open sky beyond the suffocating darkness of the bar. Elias led the way out into the harsh sunlight. He didn't touch her, didn't try to guide her. He simply walked, and she followed, a silent shadow at his heels. His wagon was tied up in front of the general store, the two sturdy mules flicking their ears in the heat. He loaded the sack of grain he'd come for, his movements methodical, his mind racing. What in God's name had he just done? He was a man who lived by a strict, simple code. Work hard, harm none, expect nothing. He had just shattered that code into 1,000 pieces. He had invited complication, responsibility, and the town's certain judgment into his solitary life. He helped her up onto the wagon seat. Her hand was feather-light in his, and for a moment, he felt the shocking fragility of her. She was all sharp angles and bird-like bones. He settled onto the seat beside her, the worn leather creaking under his weight. The space between them felt a mile wide, charged with unspoken questions and fears. He clucked to the mules, and the wagon lurched forward, pulling them away from the town of redemption and towards the vast, lonely expanse of his ranch. The journey was silent, but it was a silence of a different kind than the one Elias was used to. His silence was one of habit and loss, a quiet conversation with the ghosts of his past. This silence was heavy with the presence of another person, a person who lived her entire life in a world without sound. He found himself acutely aware of everything she might be seeing. The way the wind bent the tall prairie grass in waves, the shadow of a hawk circling high overhead, the distant, hazy line of the mountains that framed his land. He wondered what the world was like for her, if the colors were brighter, the light sharper, to make up for what she couldn't hear. As they passed the small white church at the edge of town, he saw Mrs. Gable, the Reverend's wife and the town's primary purveyor of gossip, pull back the lace curtain in her window. Her face was a mask of shock and disapproval. Elias set his jaw. He had known this was coming. By nightfall, the whole county would know that lonely Elias Thorne had bought Jedediah Vance's deaf daughter. They would whisper. They would judge. They would invent all manner of sordid reasons for his actions, none of them touching on the simple, gut-wrenching pity that had moved him. He had not bought a wife or a servant. He had bought a person out of bondage. But he knew that was a distinction the good people of redemption would fail to make. His ranch was nestled in a shallow valley, miles from the nearest neighbor. It was a hard piece of land, rocky and unforgiving, but it was his. The cabin he had built with his own hands was small but sturdy, a testament to his resilience. A plume of smoke curled from the stone chimney, a comforting sight that always signaled his return home. But today, it felt different. It was no longer just his home. As they pulled into the yard, his old dog, Buster, came trotting out from the porch, his tail giving a few hopeful thumps. Buster was a mutt of indeterminate heritage, old and grizzled, with one cloudy eye and a heart of gold. He was Elias's only constant companion. The dog stopped when he saw Alara, his head cocked. He let out a low, questioning woof. Alara flinched, shrinking back on the wagon seat. She couldn't have heard the bark, but she must have felt the vibration, or perhaps she just sensed the animal's presence. Elias swung down from the wagon. "Easy boy," he said softly. He walked over to Alara and offered his hand to help her down. She hesitated, then placed her small hand in his again. As her feet touched the ground, Buster approached slowly, his tail now wagging in a slow, curious rhythm. He stopped a few feet from her and sniffed the air. Alara stood perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the dog. Then, she did something that surprised Elias. She slowly knelt down, sinking to the dog's level. She didn't reach out her hand. She simply waited. Buster took another step, then another, until his wet nose was just inches from her face. He nudged her hand gently. A small, watery smile touched Alara's lips, the first real expression Elias had seen on her face. She carefully raised her hand and stroked the dog's grizzled head. Buster leaned into her touch, letting out a soft sigh of contentment, and sat down at her feet as if he had been waiting for her his entire life. Elias watched the scene, a strange feeling blooming in his chest. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, a tiny spark of warmth in the cold, empty rooms of his heart. Maybe, just maybe, He hadn't made a complete fool of himself after all. He cleared his throat. "Welcome home," he said, the words feeling foreign and momentous. She couldn't hear them, of course, but he hoped she could somehow understand the sentiment. He gestured towards the cabin, a simple invitation into a new, uncertain life. The cabin consisted of one main room and a small, partitioned-off bedroom. It was sparse, functional, and immaculately clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A simple table and 2 chairs sat in the center, and a dry sink and shelves for provisions occupied the other side. It was a man's home, built for solitude and survival, not comfort. The bedroom had belonged to him and his late wife, Sarah. He hadn't slept in it since she passed 3 years ago, preferring a simple cot by the fire. The room had become a shrine. The quilt she made still folded neatly on the bed, her rocking chair still in the corner. He led Alara to the bedroom door and pushed it open. The air inside was still and smelled faintly of lavender from a sachet Sarah had made. He watched Alara's face as she took it in. He had intended for her to take the cot, but looking at her now, so small and fragile, he couldn't bring himself to offer her anything less than the best he had. He pointed to the bed, then to her. Her eyes widened in disbelief. She looked from the bed, a real bed with a mattress and a beautiful quilt, back to him, her expression a mixture of confusion and awe. She shook her head, pointing to the cot by the fire and then to herself, as if to say that was all she deserved. Elias shook his head firmly. He pointed to the bedroom again, then tapped his own chest and pointed to the cot. It was a simple, clumsy conversation, but she understood. Tears welled in her eyes, and she quickly wiped them away with the back of her hand, as if ashamed of the emotion. He felt a pang of something sharp and painful in his chest. He wondered when the last time someone had shown this girl a simple act of kindness was. He left her there, pulling the door gently closed to give her some privacy. That evening, they ate in silence. He had prepared a simple stew, and he watched as she ate with a slow, deliberate hunger that spoke of long-term deprivation. She kept her eyes on her plate, as if afraid to look at him. The silence in the cabin was thick and awkward. It wasn't the companionable silence he shared with Buster, but a strained quiet filled with the things they couldn't say. After the meal, she immediately stood and began to clear the plates. He stopped her with a gentle hand on her arm. He shook his head and took the plates from her, washing them himself in the basin. He was trying to send a message: "You are not a servant here." He wasn't sure if she understood. The days that followed fell into a strange, quiet rhythm. Alara was a tireless worker. She rose before him, stoking the fire and putting coffee on to boil. She swept the cabin, tended the small vegetable garden with a natural skill, and mended his torn shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She did it all without being asked, moving with a silent efficiency that was both impressive and heartbreaking. It was clear she was trying to earn her keep, to prove the $20 he'd spent on her was not a waste. Elias tried to ease her into a different reality. He would purposefully leave tasks for himself, only to find them already done. One afternoon, he found her in the barn, struggling to hoist a heavy saddle onto a fence rail for cleaning. He went over and took it from her, his hands brushing hers. She flinched and stepped back, her eyes downcast, expecting a reprimand for touching his things. Instead, he simply set the saddle on the rail and handed her a cleaning rag, then picked one up himself. He worked on one side, she on the other. He showed her how to work the oil into the dry leather, his large, calloused hands moving slowly so she could follow. She was a quick learner, her small, nimble fingers soon mimicking his movements perfectly. They worked side by side, the only sounds the rhythmic rubbing of the rags and the soft breathing of the horses in their stalls. In that shared, simple task, a fragile bridge was being built between their two silent worlds. He began to learn her language, a language of gestures and expressions. A slight widening of her eyes meant surprise. A small frown and a shake of her head meant confusion. A quick, bird-like tilt of her head was a question. He, in turn, developed his own signs. A thumbs up for a job well done. A pat on his stomach to ask if she was hungry. A sweep of his hand towards the porch swing at the end of the day, an invitation to rest. One evening, a storm rolled in, one of those violent prairie squalls that seemed to tear the sky apart. The wind howled, a sound that Elias found both thrilling and menacing. Rain lashed against the cabin in sheets. He looked over at Alara, who was sitting at the table, sewing. She was completely placid, her needle moving in and out of the fabric with steady precision. Of course, he realized with a jolt. She couldn't hear the fury outside. For her, the world was just as quiet as it had been an hour before. But then, she stopped sewing. She lifted her head, her expression intent, a slight frown on her face. She looked towards the window, then at him. He was confused. "It's just a storm," he said, then remembered she couldn't hear him. She stood up and went to the door, peering out into the maelstrom. She turned back to him, her eyes wide with what looked like alarm. She pointed frantically out into the darkness, then made a gesture that looked like a small, four-legged animal, and then she put her hands to her chest, her face a picture of distress. Elias's blood ran cold. The new calf. He had left the new mother and her calf in the small pasture near the creek, thinking the stand of cottonwoods would offer enough shelter. He grabbed his oilskin coat and a lantern. "Stay here," he mouthed, pointing firmly at the cabin floor. She shook her head vehemently, grabbing a spare coat and pulling it on. He saw the determination in her eyes and knew it was useless to argue. They stepped out into the storm together. The wind nearly tore the door from his hand. The rain was blinding, and the lantern cast a weak, flickering circle of light that was swallowed by the immense darkness. He couldn't hear anything over the roar of the wind. They would never find the calf in this. He started towards the pasture, but Alara grabbed his arm. She shook her head and pointed in a different direction, downstream along the creek. He couldn't understand. The pasture was upstream. Why would they go that way? She tugged at his arm again, her insistence absolute. She put her hand over her heart again, then pointed into the darkness, her eyes pleading with him to trust her. He didn't know why, but he did. He let her lead him, her small hand a firm grip on his sleeve, guiding him through the gale. They stumbled through the mud and driving rain for what felt like an eternity. The creek was rising fast, a churning, angry torrent. Just as he was about to give up, to turn back, she stopped. She pointed the lantern beam towards a thicket of brush caught on a bend in the creek. There, shivering and terrified, was the calf, its leg tangled in a mess of roots and debris, the water rising perilously around it. The mother was on the bank, lowing pitifully, a sound lost in the storm. Working together, they managed to free the terrified animal. Elias hoisted the calf into his arms, its small body trembling violently against his chest. He and Alara, with the mother cow following close behind, made their way slowly back to the relative safety of the barn. Once the animals were secure and warm in a dry stall, they stood for a moment in the barn's quiet interior, the storm a muted roar outside. They were both soaked to the bone, shivering and covered in mud. Elias looked at Alara, his heart pounding with a mixture of relief and utter astonishment. "How?" he asked, the word a breath of steam in the cold air. "How did you know?" She looked up at him, her face illuminated by the lantern light. Raindrops clung to her eyelashes like tiny diamonds. She didn't try to gesture or explain. She simply reached out a cold, trembling hand and placed it gently on his chest, right over his heart. She held it there for a moment, her blue eyes locked on his. And in that moment, Elias began to understand. She hadn't heard the calf's cries with her ears. She had felt its terror. She had heard it with her heart. The thought was so strange, so profound, it left him breathless. This girl, this silent, broken girl he had bought out of pity, possessed a gift he couldn't begin to comprehend. She wasn't broken at all. She was whole in a way he had never imagined. The incident with the calf during the storm marked a profound shift in their relationship. Elias no longer saw Alara as a fragile ward to be protected, but as a partner, someone with a unique and powerful strength. The quiet respect he already felt for her resilience deepened into a kind of awe. He started to watch her more closely, trying to understand the silent language of her world. He noticed how animals were drawn to her. The way the most skittish mare in his string would lower her head for Alara to stroke her nose, how the barn cats would weave around her ankles, purring a song she couldn't hear but clearly felt. She had a connection to the living world that transcended sound. It was a form of communication more fundamental and true than any spoken word. Their need for supplies eventually forced a trip back into the town of redemption. Elias had put it off for as long as he could, dreading the inevitable scrutiny. As they rode in the wagon, he noticed Alara was more tense than usual. She sat rigidly on the seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the horizon, avoiding the sight of the town until the last possible moment. He felt a surge of protective anger. This town, with its narrow minds and sharp tongues, had been her cage for so long. Their first stop was the general store. As they stepped inside, the cheerful little bell above the door jangled, announcing their arrival. The store fell silent. Mrs. Gable, the proprietor, was behind the counter, her lips pursed into a thin line of disapproval. A few other women, customers of hers, stopped their browsing and turned to stare. Their eyes raked over Alara, filled with a cold, intrusive curiosity. Alara visibly shrank under their gaze, her shoulders hunching as she tried to make herself smaller. Elias placed his list on the counter, his expression hard as granite. "Morning, Mrs. Gable," he said, his voice level. "Thorn," she acknowledged curtly, her eyes flicking from him to Alara and back again. "See, you brought your help." The word was loaded with insinuation. Elias's hand tightened on the edge of the counter. "Her name is Alara," he said, his voice low and steady, but with an undercurrent of steel that made one of the other women take a nervous step back. Mrs. Gable was not so easily deterred. She began to measure out flour, her movements sharp and jerky. "Heard you paid a pretty penny for her," she continued, not looking at him, but speaking loudly enough for the entire store to hear. Jedediah Vance was celebrating his good fortune all over town. "Hope you kept the receipt, in case the goods are faulty." A cruel titter of laughter came from the other women. Alara, though she couldn't hear the words, understood the tone. She saw the sneering faces, the pointing fingers disguised as adjustments to bonnets. A deep flush spread up her neck, and her eyes glistened with unshed tears. She looked at the floor, her whole body radiating shame and humiliation. Something inside Elias snapped. The quiet, solitary man who never made a fuss, who absorbed life's hardships with stoic resignation, was gone. In his place was a man pushed too far. He reached across the counter and laid his hand flat on the flour sack, stopping Mrs. Gable's movements. His voice, when he spoke, was dangerously quiet, yet it carried to every corner of the store. "Her name," he repeated, enunciating each word with chilling clarity, "is Alara, and she is worth more than this whole town put together. You will show her respect, or I will take my business, and the business of any decent man I know, to the next county over." The threat was not an idle one. Elias Thorne's ranch was one of the larger operations in the area, and his business was valuable. Mrs. Gable's face paled. She looked at the cold fury in his eyes and saw that he meant every word. The other women suddenly found the patterns on the calico bolts fascinating. The silence in the store was now one of shock and fear. Elias gathered his supplies, paid his bill, and turned to Alara. He gently touched her elbow. "Let's go," he mouthed. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with astonishment. No one had ever defended her before. No one had ever stood up to the cruelty of the world on her behalf. As they walked out of the store, leaving the stunned silence behind them, she held her head just a little bit higher. He had given her back a piece of the dignity that had been stolen from her. The incident at the store, while painful, became another block in the foundation of their trust. Back at the ranch, the atmosphere was different. Alara began to come out of her shell in small, tentative ways. One afternoon, Elias found her sitting on the porch steps, a small block of wood and his whittling knife in her hands. He watched from the doorway as she worked, her fingers moving with a surprising grace and confidence. She was carving something. When she was finished, she held it up to the light. It was a perfect, tiny bird, its wings outstretched as if in mid-flight. The detail was astonishing. He had never suspected she possessed such a talent. She saw him watching and quickly tried to hide the carving, a look of fear on her face, as if she expected him to be angry that she'd used his knife. He walked over and sat down beside her. He held out his hand. Hesitantly, she placed the small wooden bird in his palm. He turned it over, admiring the delicate workmanship. He looked at her and smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes. He pointed at the bird, then gave her the thumbs-up sign he used for praise. A slow, shy smile spread across her face in return. It was like watching a flower bloom after a long winter. From then on, He made sure to leave out blocks of soft pine for her, and he found his cabin slowly filling with a menagerie of beautifully carved woodland creatures. Their communication continued to evolve. She would draw pictures in the dirt with a stick to tell him things, a drawing of a fence with a break in it, or a chicken with an X over it to show that a fox had gotten into the coop. He, in turn, began to learn the simple, self-taught hand signs she used. A hand to her mouth for food, a flat palm held out for stop, 2 fingers walking on her other palm for walk. It was a clumsy, patchwork language, but it was theirs. One evening, as he was cleaning his rifle by the fire, he was overcome by a wave of the old, familiar grief. It was the anniversary of the day he had lost Sarah and their unborn child to a fever. The pain was a physical ache in his chest. He must have had a look on his face, because Alara, who was darning a sock nearby, put down her sewing. She came over and knelt in front of him, her expression full of a deep, gentle concern. She looked at him for a long moment. Then her eyes drifted to the small, framed photograph of Sarah on the mantelpiece, the only one he owned. Her gaze went from the photo back to his face. She understood. She reached out and, with infinite gentleness, laid her hand on his arm. She didn't try to offer empty platitudes or gestures of comfort. She simply knelt there with him, a silent, steady presence in his sea of pain. Her empathy was a palpable thing, a quiet strength that seemed to absorb some of his sorrow. In that moment, he felt less alone than he had in 3 long years. He realized that this quiet, deaf girl understood his heart better than anyone in the world. She heard the silent screams of his grief, the things he could never bring himself to say aloud. The fragile peace of their world was shattered a few weeks later. Elias was repairing a harness in the barn when he heard Buster let out a series of low, angry growls. He looked up to see a figure stumbling into the yard. It was Jedediah Vance. He was drunker than usual, his clothes filthy, his face a mask of belligerent greed. "Thorn," he bellowed, swaying on his feet. "I've come for what's mine." Elias put down the harness and walked out to meet him, positioning himself between Jedediah and the cabin door. "You have no business here, Vance," Elias said, his voice flat and cold. "Leave. Not without more money." Jedediah sneered, wiping a trickle of drool from his chin. "That $20 is long gone. You got yourself a bargain, Thorn. A good, strong worker. She's worth more. I want another $50, or I'm taking her back." Just then, the cabin door creaked open. Alara stood there, her face ashen. The moment she saw her father, a look of pure, animal terror crossed her features. She backed away from the door, her hand flying to her throat. The sight of her fear sent a white-hot rage through Elias. "You're not getting another cent," Elias said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "And you will never lay a hand on her again. She's not yours anymore. Now get off my land before I have Buster help you on your way." Jedediah laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "She's my blood, my property. You got no piece of paper that says otherwise. I'll go to the sheriff. He'll see what's right." He spat on the ground, then turned and staggered back down the path he'd come, shouting threats and curses over his shoulder. Elias stood there until Jedediah was out of sight, his body rigid with fury. He turned and went back to the cabin. Alara was huddled in a corner, her arms wrapped around herself, shaking uncontrollably. He went to her, kneeling down, his anger melting away into a profound ache for her. He gently touched her shoulder. She flinched violently, then looked up and saw it was him. The terror in her eyes was slowly replaced by a desperate, pleading look. He knew what she was afraid of. She was afraid he would send her back, that the safety she had found here was temporary, that the monster from her past could reclaim her at any moment. He needed to tell her, somehow, that he would never let that happen. Words were useless. He needed an action, a promise she could see and hold. He thought for a moment, then went to the creek bed. He searched until he found a perfect stone, smooth and flat and gray. He brought it back to her. Using the tip of his knife, he carefully scratched 2 simple stick figures into the surface. One was taller, one was smaller. He drew them holding hands. Then he drew a rough outline of the cabin around them. He pressed the stone into her palm and closed her fingers around it. He looked her in the eye, his expression as serious and sincere as he could make it. He tapped the figure of himself on the stone, then her figure, then the cabin. He shook his head firmly, then pointed in the direction her father had gone. "You and I, in this house. He will not take you." She stared at the stone in her hand, her fingers tracing the crude drawing. A single tear rolled down her cheek, then another. But these were not the tears of fear or shame he had seen before. They were tears of relief, of a fragile, dawning hope. She clutched the stone to her chest, as if it were the most precious treasure on earth. She looked at him, and for the first time, he saw not just gratitude in her eyes, but a deep, burgeoning trust. He had made a silent vow, and she, with all the perception of her silent heart, had heard it loud and clear. He knew then that he would fight the whole world, if he had to keep that promise. The stakes had changed. It was no longer about pity or duty. It was about her. It was about the sanctuary they were building together, a sanctuary he would defend to his last breath. The threat of Jedediah's return cast a long shadow over the following weeks. Elias found himself constantly on edge, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of his approach. He started keeping his rifle closer at hand, a precaution that felt both necessary and deeply unsettling. The ranch, once his peaceful refuge, now felt like a fortress under siege. This new, constant tension began to change him. The quiet solitude he had once cherished now felt like a dangerous isolation. His protective instincts, awakened by Alara's presence, sharpened into a fierce, unwavering vigilance. He was no longer just Elias Thorne, lonely rancher. He was Alara's guardian, her defender. This shift in his own heart was a revelation to him. He found himself noticing small things about her that had nothing to do with her deafness or her past. He noticed the way a stray piece of cornsilk hair would catch the morning light, the intense focus in her eyes when she was tending to her small carvings, the surprising strength in her hands when she helped him hoist a hay bale. He noticed her quiet grace, a resilience that was as profound and steadfast as the mountains themselves. One evening, she laughed. It was a silent laugh, a sudden, joyful crinkling of her eyes, and a wide smile as Buster chased his own tail in circles. The sight of it, so pure and unburdened, struck him with the force of a physical blow. He realized with a stunning, terrifying clarity that his feelings for her had grown far beyond responsibility. He was falling in love with her. The realization terrified him. He was a widower, his heart a locked and bolted room he had never intended to open again. And she was a young woman who had been bought and sold, a person who deserved a life of her own choosing, not one shackled to a grieving, solitary man twice her age out of gratitude. The chasm between them seemed immense, built of age, experience, and the ugly circumstances of their meeting. He began to pull back, becoming more gruff and distant, afraid that any kindness he showed might be misinterpreted, afraid of the feelings she stirred in him. Alara, with her profound intuition, sensed his withdrawal immediately. A curtain of confusion and hurt fell over her. She became quieter, more hesitant, the small, bright sparks of joy he had started to see in her dimming once again. She worked harder than ever, as if trying to remedy some unknown failing, to earn back the simple companionship she was losing. The comfortable silence between them became strained and heavy once more. The breaking point came in the form of Reverend Miller. He rode out to the ranch one afternoon, his face a mask of pious concern that did little to hide his judgmental intentions. He found Elias splitting wood, and Alara weeding the garden nearby. "Brother Thorne," the Reverend began, dismounting from his horse. "I've come out of Christian duty. The town is concerned." "Concerned about what, Reverend?" Elias asked, not stopping the rhythmic swing of his axe. "About this arrangement," Miller said, gesturing vaguely towards the cabin and, by extension, towards Alara. "It is not seemly. A young, unmarried woman, and an unfortunate, such as herself, living under your roof. It invites gossip. It is a stain on the moral fabric of our community." Alara had stopped her work and was watching them, her eyes wide, sensing the tension in their postures. "She is safe here," Elias said, his voice tight. "Which is more than I can say for the town that allowed her father to treat her like chattel. Jedediah Vance is a sinner, to be sure," the Reverend conceded, "but he is still her father. There are institutions for girls like her, places where she can be cared for, properly, an asylum, perhaps, where she would be among her own kind." The axe stopped mid-swing. Elias slowly lowered it, his knuckles white. The word asylum hung in the air, cold and cruel. He had heard stories about those places, warehouses for the unwanted, filled with misery and neglect. The thought of Alara in such a place, her gentle spirit crushed by its callous indifference, was more than he could bear. "You will not speak of her that way," Elias said, his voice a low growl. "And you will not speak of that place again. She is not an unfortunate. She is a good, kind woman, and this is her home." The Reverend puffed out his chest, offended by the rebuke. "I am only thinking of what is best for her soul and for the reputation of our town. If you will not consider a proper institution, then you must send her back to her father. It is the only lawful and righteous path." That was the final straw. The hypocrisy, the sanctimonious cruelty disguised as piety, ignited the cold fury in Elias's soul. He took a step towards the Reverend, who instinctively backed away. "The law," Elias scoffed. "Righteousness. Was it righteous when her father sold her for whiskey money in a saloon full of men who just laughed? Was it lawful for this town to turn a blind eye for 19 years while she was starved and beaten? You come out here and preach to me about what is seemly, Reverend? You have no right. Get off my land." Now, Reverend Miller, his face mottled with indignation, scurried back to his horse and rode away, promising to pray for Elias's soul. Elias stood watching him go, his chest heaving. The confrontation had left a bitter taste in his mouth. It was a stark reminder that their sanctuary was an illusion, that the outside world and its judgment were always lurking just beyond his fence line. He turned to find Alara standing just a few feet away. She hadn't heard a word, but she had seen it all. She had seen the Reverend's condescending gestures, Elias's towering rage, and the final, angry dismissal. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with a familiar, haunted fear. The fear of being a burden. The fear of being sent away. He walked over to her, his anger draining away, leaving him feeling weary and exposed. He saw her clutch the smooth gray stone in the pocket of her apron, a talisman against the world's cruelty. He knew he had to bridge the distance he had created between them. He had to reassure her. He found her later that evening down by the creek, sitting on a fallen log, staring into the water. She was crying, the silent, shoulder-shaking sobs of someone who has learned to grieve without making a sound. His heart broke for her. He sat down beside her, not touching her, just sharing the space. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple. He didn't know how to say what he felt. The words were tangled up inside him, inadequate and clumsy. So he did the only thing he could think of. He reached out and gently took her hand. It was cold. He held it in his own, his thumb stroking the back of it. He didn't try to make signs or draw pictures. He just sat with her, holding her hand, letting his presence be his promise. He would not let the world break her. He would not let them take her. After a long time, her crying subsided. She leaned her head, just for a moment, against his shoulder. It was a gesture of complete trust, of surrender. And in that quiet moment by the creek, with the last light of day fading from the sky, Elias knew that he could no longer fight what was in his heart. He loved her, and love, he was beginning to realize, was not about locking doors to keep pain out, but about finding the courage to build a new one, together. The visit from Reverend Miller was not just a warning, it was a harbinger. Word of Elias's defiance spread through redemption like wildfire, fueled by the Reverend's righteous indignation and Mrs. Gable's gleeful gossip. The narrative was quickly set. Elias Thorne, the grieving recluse, had been bewitched by the deaf girl, living in sin and defying God's own minister. He was no longer just an eccentric, he was a pariah. This societal pressure gave Jedediah Vance the opening he'd been waiting for. He wasn't acting alone anymore. He found a willing and dangerous ally in Phineas Croft, a land speculator with a reputation for acquiring property through means that were technically legal but morally bankrupt. Croft had long coveted Elias's land, not for its rocky pastures, but for the creek that ran through it, the only reliable water source in the valley. With control of that creek, he could control all the surrounding ranches. Croft saw Alara not as a person, but as a lever. He listened to Jedediah's drunken ramblings and formulated a plan. They went to Sheriff Brody, a man whose primary motivation was to keep the peace with as little effort as possible. Croft, a man of some influence and wealth, did the talking. "Sheriff," Croft began, his voice smooth and reasonable. A great injustice has been done to our poor friend, Mr. Vance here. Jedediah, coached by Croft, put on a performance of aggrieved fatherhood. He stole her, Sheriff. My little girl. I was not in my right mind that day. Thorne took advantage of my grief and my weakness. It weren't a sale, it was a kidnapping. Sheriff Brody sighed, rubbing his temples. He didn't like Croft, and he knew Jedediah was a worthless drunk. But Croft was a powerful man, and the story, however flimsy, touched upon the sacred rights of a father. Plus, the whole town was already buzzing about the impropriety of the situation at the Thorne Ranch. Dealing with it would quiet things down. What do you want me to do, Croft? The sheriff asked wearily. Simply enforce the law, Croft said with a thin smile. The girl is Mr. Vance's legal ward. She belongs with her father. We demand you ride out there and return his property to him. The word property made even Brody flinch, but the legal standing was undeniable. A drunken agreement in a saloon held no weight against a father's claim. His duty was clear, if distasteful. The next afternoon, Sheriff Brody rode out to the Thorne Ranch. Elias saw him coming from a long way off and felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. He met the sheriff in the yard, Alara watching anxiously from the cabin doorway. Elias, Brody began, not meeting his eyes. I'm here on official business. Jedediah Vance has filed a formal complaint. He wants his daughter back. She's not going back, Elias said, his voice dangerously calm. It's not your choice, the sheriff said, his tone hardening. He's her father. Legally, she belongs to him. The whole town's in an uproar over this. I can't ignore it. You're accused of abducting her. Abducting her? Elias repeated in disbelief. I saved her. You know what he is, Brody. You know what kind of life she had with him. What I know doesn't matter, the sheriff countered, finally looking at him, his face grim. What the law says is what matters. I'm giving you a choice. You can hand her over peacefully, or I can come back with deputies and take her by force. And I'll have to arrest you for kidnapping. I'll give you 24 hours to come to your senses. Have her in my office by noon tomorrow. With that, the sheriff turned his horse and rode away, leaving his ultimatum hanging in the air like a death sentence. Elias stood frozen, the world narrowing to a single, terrifying point. They were going to take her. They were going to feed her back to the wolf. He looked over at Alara, who was watching his face, her own expression a mirror of his despair. She couldn't have heard the words, but she felt their devastating impact. She knew. He walked into the cabin, his mind a whirlwind of impossible options. They could run, but where? They would be hunted, and with no money and a woman who couldn't hear, they wouldn't last a week. He could fight, but that would only land him in jail and her in an asylum or back with Jedediah. He was trapped. The law, the church, the entire town was arrayed against them. He sat down at the table, his head in his hands. He felt Alara's presence beside him, a light touch on his shoulder. He looked up at her. Her face was etched with fear, but also with a fierce, resolute strength that humbled him. She would not be broken. She was waiting for him to tell her what to do. He knew there was only one path. It was a desperate, crazy gamble, a path that would bind them together in a way he had never dared to imagine. But it was the only way to give her the protection of the law, to turn her from property into a person in the eyes of the world. He had to make her his wife. The idea was overwhelming. Marriage was a sacred vow, a promise of love and partnership. He did love her, he realized with a certainty that cut through his fear. He loved her strength, her kindness, her silent, perceptive heart. But to ask her now, under these circumstances, felt like a coercion, another transaction that took away her choice. He had to try. He had to make her understand. He took a deep breath. He took her hands in his, looking directly into her eyes. He needed to be clear. He picked up a piece of charcoal from the hearth and, on a clean pine board, he drew a picture of a church. Then he drew two stick figures, him and her, standing in front of it, before a preacher. He pointed to the drawing, then looked at her, his heart pounding. He slowly raised his left hand and pointed to his ring finger. Then, his hand trembling slightly, he reached out and gently touched the third finger of her left hand. He held his breath, watching her face. He saw comprehension dawn in her eyes, followed by a wave of complex emotions, shock, confusion, and then something else he couldn't quite read. Was it fear or hope? He was offering her a cage to save her from a monster, a legal bond to protect her from the chains of blood. He was asking her to marry him, a lonely, grieving rancher, not for love, but for a name, for protection. She looked from his hand to his face, her gaze searching, probing, looking past the desperate plan to the truth in his heart. She saw the fear there, but she also saw the fierce protectiveness, the deep, abiding respect, the love he didn't know how to speak. She saw his heart, just as she always had. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, she gave a single, slow, deliberate nod. A wave of relief so profound it made him dizzy washed over Elias. Her acceptance was a gift, a leap of faith that he knew he would spend the rest of his life trying to deserve. But there was no time for relief. The clock was ticking. Noon tomorrow. He had less than a day to find a way to make it official. He knew Reverend Miller would never marry them. But he had heard of a traveling justice of the peace who worked the mining camps up in the hills, a man who cared more for the fee than for town gossip. It was a long shot and a hard ride. He stood up, his mind clear and focused. He had a plan. He looked at Alara and gave her a small, determined smile. He pointed to himself, then made a gesture like riding a horse, and then pointed towards the mountains. He then held up one finger for one day. I am going. I will be back. She nodded, her expression resolute. She understood. Their fight had begun. The ride into town felt like a ride to the gallows. Elias sat straight on the wagon seat, the reins held firmly in his hands. Beside him, Alara was a study in quiet composure, though he could feel the tension radiating from her. She was wearing her best dress, a simple blue calico she had mended and washed until it was soft and faded. Her corn silk hair was neatly braided. She looked not like a victim being dragged to a hearing, but like a woman of substance and dignity. In his pocket, a folded piece of paper felt both as heavy as a stone and as light as a feather. It was their marriage certificate, signed at dawn by a bleary-eyed justice of the peace who had been more interested in Elias's $10 gold piece than in the particulars of the union. It was all they had. As they reached the edge of town, they could see the crowd already gathering in front of the sheriff's office, which also served as the town courthouse. It seemed all of redemption had turned out for the spectacle. He saw Mrs. Gable, whispering excitedly to her friends. He saw Reverend Miller, his face a mask of stern judgment. And he saw Phineas Croft, standing beside a smirking Jedediah Vance, looking for all the world like a man who had already won. Elias pulled the wagon to a halt and helped Alara down. As they began to walk towards the courthouse steps, a hush fell over the crowd. Every eye was on them. The whispers started, a low, venomous hiss. Shameless, living in sin, poor, broken creature, Elias felt Alara flinch beside him, but she did not lower her gaze. She kept her eyes fixed on the courthouse door, her small hand clutching the smooth gray stone in her pocket. Sheriff Brody met them at the top of the steps, his face grim. Thorne, I see you've made your decision. Before Elias could answer, Jedediah pushed his way forward. Give her to me, he slurred, reaching a grimy hand towards Alara. She's my property, my daughter. Elias moved instantly, placing himself between them. You will not touch her, he said, his voice ringing with authority. The law says she's mine. Jedediah shot back, appealing to the sheriff. He's got no claim to her. Phineas Croft stepped forward, placing a calming hand on Jedediah's shoulder. The sheriff is right, Mr. Thorne, he said smoothly. This is a simple matter of paternal rights. The girl must be returned to her father's care. It is the law. The crowd murmured in agreement. The law was the law. A father was a father. Elias could feel the tide of public opinion turning definitively against him. He saw the doubt in the sheriff's eyes. He had to speak, to make them understand. The law, Elias said, his voice rising to be heard by everyone. You want to talk about the law? I'll tell you about the law of decency. The law of compassion. This man, he said, pointing a trembling finger at Jedediah, neglected this girl her entire life. He starved her, beat her, and when he was done with her, he sold her for $20 in a saloon. And this town let him. You all saw it. You all knew. And you did nothing. You speak of the law, but you know nothing of justice. His words hit home. A few people in the crowd had the grace to look ashamed. But Croft was ready. These are baseless accusations, he said with a dismissive wave. The ravings of a man trying to justify his own sinful actions. He has no proof. All we have is a father's love for his child. The absurdity of the statement was breathtaking. Jedediah tried to look paternal and concerned, an expression that his whiskey-soaked features could not quite manage. It looked like they were losing. The sheriff was shifting his weight, preparing to make his decision. Elias felt a moment of pure despair. It was then that Alara moved. She had been standing silently beside Elias, observing everything, her perceptive eyes missing nothing. She saw the smug look on Croft's face, the weakness in the sheriff's, the hatred in her father's. And she saw the desperation in Elias's. She knew that his words were not enough. She had to make them see. She stepped forward, away from the shelter of Elias's side. She walked directly to where the sheriff's young daughter, a girl of about 7, stood half-hiding behind her mother's skirts. The girl looked at Alara with wide, curious eyes. Alara reached into her pocket and pulled out the small, perfectly carved wooden bird. She knelt down and offered it to the child. The little girl hesitated, then took the bird, her face breaking into a smile of pure delight. Then Alara stood and walked towards the reverend's wife, a woman known for her piety and her prize-winning rose garden. Alara paused before her, then reached into her other pocket and pulled out a small, intricately carved rose, each petal rendered in perfect detail from a piece of scrap pine. She offered this, too, as a simple, silent gift. The woman took it, her mouth falling open in astonishment at its beauty. These small, unexpected acts of grace and artistry shifted the mood of the crowd. They were not the actions of a broken creature or a mindless piece of property. They were the actions of a person with a soul, with a gift. Finally, Alara turned back to the center of the confrontation. She looked at her father, and for the first time, there was no fear in her eyes. Only a deep, profound pity for the small, wretched man he was. Then she turned to Elias. She walked to him, stood before him, and took his large, calloused hand in both of hers. She held it tightly, a silent declaration for all to see. She turned to face the crowd, her hand still holding his, and with her free hand, she made a simple, powerful sign. She placed it flat over her own heart, held it there for a beat, and then pointed directly at Elias. Her meaning was unmistakable, a message that needed no sound to be understood. This is my heart. This is my home. This is my choice. The raw, silent emotion of the gesture silenced the crowd completely. The women, in particular, saw the truth of it. They saw the frightened girl who had found a protector. They saw the lonely man who had found someone to care for. They saw a love that was purer and more honest than any of the hypocritical pronouncements of the town's leaders. Jedediah, seeing he was losing, lunged forward again. She's mine. She belongs to me. It was at that moment that Elias played his final card. He raised their joined hands in the air. She belongs to no one but herself, he declared, his voice booming with a newfound certainty. And she has chosen to be with me. She is not his property. She is not my ward. She is my wife. He reached into his pocket and produced the folded certificate, handing it to the stunned sheriff. Brody unfolded it, his eyes scanning the document. He looked at the signature of the justice of the peace. It was legal. It was binding. The ground had been completely cut from under Jedediah and Croft. It's a trick, Croft sputtered. A sham. But it was too late. The law that Croft had been so eager to champion was now on Elias's side. A wife could not be compelled to return to her father. She was no longer her father's ward. The sheriff, seeing the legal document and the overwhelming shift in the crowd's sentiment, made his decision. The document is legal, Brody announced, his voice firm. The matter is settled. Alara Thorne stays with her husband. Vance, if you ever bother them again, I'll have you arrested for harassment. Now disperse, all of you. The show is over. Phineas Croft's face was a mask of fury. His perfect plan had crumbled to dust. He shot Elias a look of pure venom before turning and storming away. Jedediah Vance seemed to deflate, the drunken belligerence draining out of him, leaving only a pathetic, defeated old man. He stared at his daughter, who met his gaze not with fear or hatred, but with a final, quiet finality. Then she turned her back on him, and on the life he represented, forever. Elias and Alara walked down the courthouse steps, their hands still clasped together. A few of the townsfolk, who moments before had been whispering against them, now nodded their heads in a new, grudging respect. Mrs. Gable hurried back into her store without a word. They had faced down the town's prejudice and hypocrisy, and they had won. Not with anger or violence, but with quiet dignity and the undeniable truth of their connection. As they walked towards their wagon, a new and unfamiliar feeling settled over Elias. It was peace. The ride back to the ranch was imbued with a profound and peaceful silence. The hostile quiet of their first journey from town had been replaced by a deep, shared stillness, the kind that exists between two people who have weathered a great storm together and found safe harbor. They didn't need to speak. The confrontation in town, Alara's silent, powerful declaration, and the legal finality of the paper in Elias's pocket had said everything that needed to be said. They were bound together now, not by a desperate transaction or a protective arrangement, but by a public stand and a mutual choice. When they arrived back at the cabin, the familiar landscape seemed different, transformed. It was no longer just Elias's ranch, it was their home. The threat that had been looming over them for weeks had been vanquished, and the air itself felt lighter, cleaner. Buster greeted them with joyful, thumping tail wags, seeming to sense the change in the atmosphere. That evening, they sat on the porch swing as the sun bled across the western sky, painting the mountains in hues of gold and rose. Elias looked at Alara, truly seeing her not as the deaf girl he had rescued, but as the strong, resilient woman who had stood with him, who had, in her own powerful way, rescued him right back. He had offered her his name for protection, but she had given him back his heart. She was no longer defined by her silence or her past, but by her courage and the quiet grace that was so intrinsically hers. She was his wife. The word still felt new and strange and wonderful on his tongue. He had never imagined he would say it again. He had thought that part of his life was over, buried with Sarah. But sitting here, with Alara beside him, he felt not a betrayal of that memory, but an expansion of his capacity to love. It was a different love, born not of youthful passion but of shared hardship, mutual respect, and a communication that ran deeper than words. Alara turned to him, a small, gentle smile on her lips. She had been watching his face, reading the play of emotions there as easily as he might read a book. She reached into her apron pocket and her hand emerged not with the gray stone, but with the small, carved bird she had made on one of her first days at the ranch. She held it for a moment. Then she pressed it firmly into his hand, closing his fingers around it. It was a gift, a symbol of the freedom and safety he had given her, a symbol of her own spirit, which he had allowed to take flight. He closed his hand around the smooth, warm wood. He didn't have a carving or a stone to give her in return. All he had was the truth, a truth that filled his chest and demanded to be expressed, even if it couldn't be heard. He gently touched the side of her face, his thumb stroking her cheekbone. He leaned in, his gaze holding hers, trying to pour all the unspoken emotion, all the gratitude and love and awe he felt for her, into that one look. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed for just a second. When she opened them again, they were shining with a light that mirrored the love in his own. She took his hand, the one that held the bird, and placed it over her heart. He could feel its steady, rhythmic beat against his palm. A beat that was calm and strong and sure. It was a rhythm that spoke of safety, of home, of a profound and abiding love that needed no words, no sound, to be heard. The last rays of the sun washed over them, casting their two silhouettes as one against the vast, quiet landscape. He knew, in that moment, that he had not just bought a girl from her father. He had found the missing part of his own soul. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. Her true worth was finally seen. What does true value in a person mean to you? Tell us below.